Ron Howard has directed some of the biggest stars in Hollywood history. He's worked with legends. He sat across from some of the most talented actors who ever lived. But in a rare, candid moment, he revealed something most directors never say out loud. Some of the most famous actors from Hollywood's golden age weren't just difficult to work with. They were genuinely evil. Their behavior off-camera was so dark, so cruel, so disturbing, that it changed how he understood fame itself. What he revealed shocked everyone. Ron Howard isn't someone who typically gossips about Hollywood. He's known for being professional, respectful, and thoughtful about the industry he's been part of since childhood. His father was an actor. He grew up on sets. He understands that show business is complicated. People are complicated. But there's a difference between understanding complexity and staying silent about genuine harm. Ron Howard has directed over 50 films. He's worked with Tom Hanks multiple times. He's directed Russell Crowe, Morgan Freeman, Jennifer Connelly, and dozens of other major stars. He's been in this industry for more than 60 years, first as a child actor on The Andy Griffith Show, then as a young actor, and finally as one of the most respected directors in cinema history. He's seen Hollywood from every angle. He's watched how it operates. He's observed patterns that most people never notice because they're not paying attention or they're too afraid to say anything. What makes Ron Howard's perspective valuable isn't just his longevity in the industry. It's that he's been trusted by major stars throughout his career. Directors learn things about actors that the public never sees. They see how people treat crew members. They see what happens when cameras stop rolling. They observe the gap between the public persona and the private person. Ron Howard has accumulated decades of first-hand knowledge about who these people really are. But for most of his career, he kept quiet. That's what you're supposed to do in Hollywood. You protect the industry. You protect the stars. You maintain the illusion. Speaking out about actors' bad behavior has consequences. It can damage careers, create enemies, and make you persona non grata in an industry you've devoted your entire life to. So most directors, producers, and crew members stay silent. They keep their stories private. They take their knowledge to the grave. Then something shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the changing culture around accountability. Maybe it was realizing that staying silent makes you complicit. Whatever the reason, Ron Howard decided to break that code of silence and reveal the truth about 6 major actors from Hollywood's golden age. People whose behavior was so troubling that it deserved to be part of the historical record. But identifying these actors required going back into history and examining patterns of cruelty that had been carefully hidden for decades. When Ron Howard began revealing details about these actors, the first name he mentioned shocked people because it contradicted everything the public thought they knew about this person. This was someone whose image had been carefully cultivated as charming, sophisticated, and beloved. Someone who'd built a career on playing characters that audiences loved. Someone whose public persona was so polished, so perfect, that almost nobody questioned it. But behind closed doors, according to Ron Howard and multiple crew members who worked on sets with this actor, the reality was completely different. This person treated people with contempt. They demanded special treatment. They made crew members cry. They created hostile work environments where people were afraid to make mistakes because they never knew how this actor would react. Some days they were charming. Other days they were brutal. The unpredictability itself was a form of control. What made this behavior particularly evil, according to Howard, wasn't just the rudeness. It was the calculation behind it. This actor knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the power dynamic. They understood that crew members couldn't fight back because they'd lose their jobs. They understood that other actors wouldn't speak up because everyone was afraid of being blacklisted. And they used that understanding to justify treating people however they wanted. The disturbing part is that this behavior happened on multiple sets, over many years, and almost nobody said anything publicly until Ron Howard decided to break the silence. Crew members had told stories privately. Other actors knew what was happening, but the industry's code of silence kept these stories contained. Nobody wanted to be the person who destroyed a beloved star's reputation. Nobody wanted to be seen as a troublemaker or a snitch. But Ron Howard recognized something important. Staying silent about this actor's behavior meant allowing them to continue hurting people. It meant protecting their reputation over protecting vulnerable crew members who had no power to defend themselves. It meant deciding that one person's comfort and image was more important than multiple people's dignity and psychological safety. This realization became the catalyst for Howard to start naming names and telling the stories that had been hidden in Hollywood for far too long. As Ron Howard revealed more names, something became clear. This wasn't about isolated incidents. This was about a pattern. A systematic pattern of abuse that had been enabled by an industry that valued image over integrity. These actors shared something in common. They were all powerful. They all had leverage. They all understood that the system would protect them because they made money for studios. And they all exploited that protection to treat people badly. What's particularly revealing is that Howard didn't just talk about individual bad moments. He talked about decades-long patterns of behavior. He talked about actors who had reputations for being difficult that everyone in the industry knew about, but nobody discussed publicly. There were whispered conversations on sets. There were warnings passed between crew members. Watch out when working with this person. There were stories that circulated in private that would never make it into newspapers or magazines because studios controlled the media narrative. One of the most disturbing aspects of these patterns was how they targeted the most vulnerable people on set. Not other major stars. Not producers or directors who had power to push back. The abuse was directed at assistants, makeup artists, costume designers, production assistants. People at the bottom of the hierarchy who had no ability to defend themselves. This reveals something important about the nature of this cruelty. It wasn't about standing up to equals or challenging people with power. It was about taking out frustration and ego on people who couldn't fight back. Howard explained that he'd witnessed this dynamic countless times. An actor would be pleasant to the director, the producers, and other important people. But the moment they were around crew members, their demeanor would change. They'd become dismissive, demanding, and cruel. They'd throw things. They'd yell. They'd humiliate people in front of others. And nobody stopped them because stopping them would require confrontation, and confrontation might damage the production or end the actor's career. And the industry decided that protecting careers was more important than protecting people. What Ron Howard realized over the years was that this pattern revealed a fundamental truth about Hollywood. The system itself enabled evil behavior. It didn't just allow it. It actively protected it. As long as an actor was profitable and famous, the industry would cover for them, make excuses for them, and punish anyone who tried to expose them. This understanding set the stage for Howard to reveal why these actors were able to get away with their behavior for so long. Here's what Ron Howard emphasized repeatedly. Talent doesn't excuse cruelty. But in Hollywood's golden age, it often did. Studios operated under a simple philosophy. If you made money, you were protected. If your films were successful, if audiences loved you, if your name on a marquee sold tickets, then the studio would shield you from consequences. They would bury stories. They would pay off people who threatened to go public. They would create narratives that protected your image. This created a perverse incentive system. The more talented you were, the more power you had to be cruel. The bigger your box office draw, the more the industry would tolerate your behavior. Studios essentially told these actors, "We don't care how you treat people behind the scenes. We only care about what you produce on camera." That message was received loud and clear. And some actors responded by treating their talent as licensed to be horrible. What made this particularly evil, according to Howard, was that these actors understood exactly what they were doing. They weren't acting out of ignorance. They weren't unaware of how their behavior affected people. They were making deliberate choices to use their power to hurt others because they could. Because they'd learned that nothing would happen to them. Because the system had made it clear that their talent was worth more than anyone's dignity. One specific example Ron Howard mentioned involved an actor whose behavior on set was so toxic that crew members would dread working with him. But when the film came out, it was a massive success. The actor received acclaim. Critics praised their performance. And the studio immediately cast them in another project, despite knowing full well the environment they'd created. The message was unmistakable: talent trumps everything. What's particularly revealing is that several of these actors maintained public images as decent people. They did charity work. They gave interviews where they talked about respecting their craft. They presented themselves as serious artists. But according to Howard and multiple other sources, this public persona was entirely fabricated. Behind closed doors, they were narcissists who viewed other people as tools to be used and discarded. The disconnect between their public image and private behavior was so extreme that it raises a troubling question about how well we actually know celebrities. If someone can maintain a beloved public persona while simultaneously being cruel to vulnerable people, what does that say about our ability to judge character from what we see on screen? For decades, people who knew about these actors' behavior stayed quiet. Crew members who'd been mistreated didn't speak up. Other actors who'd witnessed the cruelty didn't go public. Directors who'd experienced these dynamics firsthand kept silent. And the reason was simple. Speaking up had consequences. You could lose your career. You could be blacklisted. You could be sued. The studios had lawyers and money and power. Regular people had nothing. Ron Howard talked about knowing crew members who were traumatized by their experiences working with certain actors, but who felt they couldn't say anything because they needed the work. Film production is seasonal. You work on one project, then you hope to get hired for the next one. If you become known as someone who causes trouble, someone who speaks out against powerful people, studios won't hire you. Your career ends. So people swallowed their pain and moved on to the next job, carrying their trauma with them. What's particularly troubling is that this silence didn't just protect the abusive actors. It enabled them to continue their behavior. If nobody speaks up, if nobody faces consequences, then the abusive actor learns that they can keep doing this forever. They can treat people however they want without any repercussions. The silence becomes a form of permission. It tells them, what you're doing is acceptable. Keep going. Howard pointed out that studios also had financial motivation to keep these stories quiet. Admitting that one of their biggest stars was abusive would damage their investment. It would create negative publicity. It would potentially tank the actor's career and cost the studio millions of dollars. So studios actively suppressed these stories. They used legal threats. They paid people off. They created false narratives that made accusers look unreliable or attention-seeking. The result was a system where abusive actors faced almost zero consequences for their actions. They kept working. They kept getting bigger roles. They kept building their legacies. Meanwhile, the people they'd hurt carried those wounds in silence, unable to process their trauma publicly because doing so would destroy their livelihoods. Ron Howard recognized that by staying silent himself for so long, he'd been complicit in this system. He'd known about these actors' behavior. He'd chosen not to speak publicly about it. And in doing so, he'd helped maintain the infrastructure that protected abusers and silenced victims. That realization became the reason he finally decided to break his silence, no matter what the consequences might be. One of the most striking things about Ron Howard's revelations was how many of these actors died without ever facing public accountability for their behavior. They lived long, successful lives. They were celebrated at award shows. They received lifetime achievement honors. They were memorialized as legends of cinema. And the entire time, the industry knew what they'd done to people behind closed doors. This disconnect is jarring. Hollywood created a system where you could be a legendary actor, beloved by millions, honored by your peers, and simultaneously be a person who systematically hurt vulnerable people and face zero consequences. You'd die with your reputation intact. Your legacy would be protected. Your films would be celebrated. And the people you'd mistreated would be left to process their trauma in silence. Howard talked about attending memorial services for some of these actors, listening to people praise their talent and their contributions to cinema, and thinking about the crew members who'd been damaged by their cruelty. He thought about the assistants who'd cried in bathrooms because of how they'd been treated. He thought about the production assistants who'd quit the industry because the experience had traumatized them. He thought about all the people whose careers had been derailed or whose mental health had been damaged by exposure to this behavior. What made this particularly infuriating to Howard was that the industry had the power to hold these people accountable and chose not to. Studios could have refused to work with them. Directors could have spoken up. Other actors could have supported victims. But instead, everyone prioritized protecting the system over protecting people. Everyone decided that maintaining the illusion of a glamorous, talent-driven industry was more important than acknowledging the darkness within it. The lack of reckoning also sent a message to younger generations of actors. You can get away with this. If you're talented enough, if you're profitable enough, if you understand how to work the system, you can treat people however you want and nothing will happen. That message perpetuated cycles of abuse that continued well beyond Hollywood's golden age. But what Ron Howard realized was that silence doesn't protect anyone anymore. The culture has changed. People are willing to speak up now. Stories that would have been buried 50 years ago are now exposed. And the industry is slowly, painfully, beginning to reckon with its past. Ron Howard didn't reveal these stories for attention. By the time he decided to speak publicly, he was already one of the most respected directors in Hollywood history. He didn't need more fame. He didn't need more credibility. He had nothing to gain professionally by breaking decades of silence. In fact, he had something to lose: relationships with people still alive, potential backlash from the industry, complications with his legacy. But he spoke out anyway, and his explanation was simple. Staying silent had become morally indefensible. He talked about realizing that protecting the reputation of dead actors was less important than honoring the truth and the people who'd been hurt. He talked about understanding that his silence had been a choice to prioritize image over integrity. And he decided he couldn't make that choice anymore. What's important about Howard's decision is that it came from recognizing a fundamental truth. Cultures change by people breaking silence. As long as everyone stays quiet, abusive systems perpetuate themselves. But the moment someone with credibility and power decides to tell the truth, it becomes possible for others to do the same. It creates space for victims to come forward. It validates their experiences. It proves that speaking up doesn't have to destroy you. Howard also recognized that this wasn't just about the past. The patterns he identified in Hollywood's golden age didn't disappear. They evolved. They adapted. The industry still prioritizes profit over people. It still protects powerful abusers. It still silences victims. Speaking about historical abuse was a way of shining light on current systems that perpetuate similar harm. What's striking is that Ron Howard's revelations didn't destroy Hollywood or end anyone's career. The industry survived. Life went on. And the only thing that changed was that the truth was finally part of the public record. People now knew things they didn't know before. They could make informed judgments about these actors' legacies. They could recognize patterns of behavior that had been hidden. Most importantly, Howard's decision to speak gave permission to other people, crew members, other actors, directors, to share their own stories. His credibility made it harder for the industry to dismiss these accounts as gossip or exaggeration. He'd essentially used his position of power to amplify voices that had been silenced for decades. In the end, Ron Howard's willingness to break silence revealed something crucial. Accountability doesn't have to come immediately. It doesn't have to come during someone's lifetime. But it can still matter. It can still change how we understand history. It can still honor the people who were hurt. And it can still prevent similar abuse from continuing in the future. So here's what I want to ask you. Do you think Ron Howard should have spoken out sooner? Should directors and crew members have broken silence during these actors' lifetimes, even if it meant personal consequences? And more importantly, what responsibility do we have as audiences to question the gap between an actor's public image and their private behavior? Let me know what you think in the comments below.